Ivan van Sertima was educated at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University, and the Rutgers Graduate School, and holds degrees in African Studies, Linguistics, and Anthropology. He is a literary critic, linguist, and an anthropologist, and has made a name in all three fields. As a literary critic, he is the author of several major literary reviews published in Denmark, India, Britain, and the United States. He was honored for his work in this field by being asked by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature from 1976 to 1980. He has also been honored as an historian of world repute by being invited to join UNESCO's International Commission for the Rewriting of the Scientific and Cultural History of Mankind. As a linguist, he compiled the Swahili Dictionary of Legal Terms based on his fieldwork in Tanzania, East Africa in 1967. He is the author of They Came Before Columbus, the African Presence in Ancient America, which was published in French in 1981. And are you ready for this? It is now in its 16th printing. That's quite an achievement. Dr. van Sertima, Professor of African Studies at Rutgers University, is editor of the Journal of African Civilizations. Recent books he has edited include Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern, Black Women in Antiquity, Egypt Revisited, Nile Valley Civilizations, African Presence in Early Asia, African Presence in Early Europe, African Presence in Early America, Great African Thinkers, and Great Black Leaders, Ancient and Modern. Dr. van Sertima has lectured to more than 100 universities in the United States, the Caribbean, South America, and Europe. He appeared before Congress on July 7, 1987, to challenge the Columbus myth, and he also was there to set the record straight, might I add. Please join me in welcoming my husband, Ivan van Sertima.
I'm a little overawed by that introduction. I've heard that before, but I want to dedicate this lecture naturally to my wife and to my son. I appeared before Congress on July the 7th, 1987 to challenge the Columbus myth. It was a really extraordinary and unexpected invitation, but the Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission was meeting, and the oversee committee of Congress wanted to check into what they were doing, and they had heard word that there was a very serious challenge to Columbus's to the claim that Columbus had discovered America. So I was invited to give due cause why we should not celebrate this as a discovery by Columbus. I pointed out to Congress that I'm not the first person to suggest that Columbus was not the first person to come to the New World and visit the Native Americans. Columbus was the first person to suggest it. He actually said in the journal of his second voyage, Columbus, by the way, made 4 voyages in this direction, and he actually said when he was on his second voyage and when he was in Haiti, which was then called Hispaniola, he said that when he was there, the Native Americans came to him and told him that black-skinned people had come in boats, in large boats from the south and southeast, trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Now, note this. Note how the evidence builds up. People have accused me at times of being ahistorical, but by that they mean that it is not possible, and I have not found it possible, and no one can find it really possible, to reconstruct the early history of America and early history of Africa in the way we reconstruct it in Europe. Europe, in spite of its great tribal wars, has had the enormous advantage of having an archival continuity. That is, you can go to the libraries in Europe and you can track back hundreds of years of history in detail. You cannot do that in Africa, and you cannot do that in America. The reason is not the lack of books. Please do not misunderstand that. The Native Americans had thousands of books. We only have about half a dozen survivals of books in America. We have the Popol Vuh, the Bible of the Quiche Maya. We have the Codex Dresden, the Codex Madrid, the Codex Troana, the Codex Natal, the Codex this and that, the Titulo Coyoy. And the reason why we only have those fragments is because of the deliberate, systematic destruction of books in America. There were 3 massive, systematic destruction of books in America. Bishop Landon, the Yucatan, said, "Burn them all. They are works of the devil." That is the reason why we have so little surviving. These are not people without books. The same thing is true of Africa. Africa has as many writing systems as Europe. Europe has very few writing systems. Take the words, "They came before Columbus." They came before Columbus. Those are Anglo-Saxon songs. The script is not English. English has no script. That's Roman. The French have no script. It's Roman. The Spanish have no script. It's Roman. The Germans have no script. It's Roman. Only a few European tribes had writing systems. The Greek, the Roman, the Russian, there's the Cyrillic alphabet in Russia. There are 1 or 2 other scripts like the Phoenician script, which is half and half. According to the Book of Balimut, it has half a foot in Africa. The Celtic script, no, the Phoenician script has half a foot in Egypt. The Celtic script has half a foot in Africa, Egypt is also in Africa, but I'm talking about Africa outside of Egypt, where you find the Celtic Ogham, where you find it even in southern Africa. It has been found carved on some of the stones in southern Africa. Africa has just as many scripts. Africa has the Mande script. You can go back to Utmurtetek, 3200 BC, and find African writing on the Saharan rocks. You have the Mande script. At Utmurtetek, you have the Akan script, both a drum script and a written script. You have the Faka script, which is found in Suriname even to this day, the only script that traveled to America with Africans. You have the Meroitic script, which they're trying to crack at UNESCO. They have found 800 and something books, African books, pre-Christian books in Meroitic, which have not yet been deciphered. And then there is the Bai script, which is a modern variant of the Mande. And then there is the hieroglyphic script, which is proven to be pre-Egyptian. It is developed among Africans on the edge of the Sudan in a place called Kustal before it's moved up and developed further in Egypt. So it's not a matter of lack of writing, but you have massive destruction of African books as well. You have the destruction of books in the Library of Alexandria. When Bishop Theodosius ordered the fire to be put to the Library of Alexandria, we only have fragments. We still have medical books, 10 medical books surviving from Africa. Earlier than any medical books in the world, we still have mathematical papyri surviving from Africa, earlier than any in the world. We still have thousands of inscriptions by ancient Africans in the hieroglyphic script. And we have the destruction of libraries, the Timbuktu, which is razed to the ground twice. We've now found manuscripts under the ground, preserved in dry earth, which we're trying to recover. And then there's the destruction of the Moorish libraries when Africans and Arabs and some of the Jews and even some of the Europeans used the Arabic script when it was the language of Arabic was the language of science during the Moorish period. And you have the massive destruction again of books, 84,000 manuscripts destroyed in Granada. That is the reason why we have to go to all of these disciplines in order to reconstruct the history of America. So it's not an historical method, it's the only historical methodology that we can. We have to go we have to realize that because of this destruction, that history does not only exist in books, history exists in skulls, history exists in plants, history exists in languages, history exists in terracotta, clay sculptures or stone sculptures. History exists in all of these things. Every artifact, every ritual, every language, all of these things are links. It's like a detective story. This is one of the most extraordinary and exciting things about the reconstruction of the history of the New World and of Africa. That the explosion has occurred, but you can still pick up the pieces. I was very struck by the fact that the explosion occurred, the NASA spaceship flew up on its pad, and we could not tell for months whether the spacemen knew they were going to die. We did not know that because the whole thing was scattered all over the Atlantic into thousands of pieces. And then eventually we found the black box and we heard one sound, oh oh. And we knew that the captain knew and the crew knew that something had gone wrong and that they started falling for 9 miles before they were crushed. And we discovered the black spaceman putting out his hand to tighten the seat belt of the other spaceman, and we know that they actually struggled and they actually knew they were going to die in that absolute final hour. It took months to discover that because we had to pick up all the pieces. That is the history of America and of Africa. Africa is an exploded star, a shattered diamond. And it becomes necessary to go in all parts of the world, various periods, to pick up the pieces by going to various fields, various disciplines. So it's not an ahistorical method. Here is Columbus saying that the natives told him so. That's not enough, but look how the evidence piles up and becomes conclusive. Columbus, whether he believed it or not, he sent back samples of spears that these Native Americans in Haiti said they were trading with these black-skinned people. And when these spears were assayed in Spain by the Spanish metallurgists, they found to their astonishment that they were identical, not similar, identical with spears then being forged in African Guinea. These spears had the same ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as spears being forged in Africa. That is the metallurgical story. Apart from the oral tradition of the natives who told Columbus so, there's the metallurgical evidence. Then comes the linguistic evidence. The word they were using for these spears that these black traders had brought in boats was guanine. And he found a range of words along the Caribbean and in parts of South America, along the Atlantic coast of America. We found the word for gold, and for these gold-tipped spears were identical with the words along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Ghana, the name of a great African empire, the word means gold, it also means war leader. Ghana, Ghani, Ghanin, Guana, Guanabo, all of these words linked. The same words appearing in Africa and appearing in America on the same Atlantic coast crossed by the ocean. And then we find other strange words. Words not connected at all, yet meaning the same thing. Arbitrary words. Nuka, nuke, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a gold word. It's used for certain types of jewelry. And Africans were particularly adept at the development and cultivation of special kinds of gold jewelry. Tua, a whole range of words. Tumbaga. All of these things connected with the gold trade are passing from one to the other. And then when we leave the linguistics, we find something even more astonishing. That the Portuguese who had entered West Africa very early, about 50 years before Columbus, saw a cotton growing plentifully along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Assuming it to be African, they took this cotton, this is before Columbus, 30 years before Columbus at least, and planted it into one of the Cape Verde Islands just off Africa. And when botanists studied this cotton, assuming it to be African, they put it in the lab, they found it was Gossypium hirsutum var punctatum. Okay, don't get confused by the strange terminology. Gossypium is cotton, hirsutum is an American brand of cotton, var is the variety punctatum. The variety punctatum of the hirsutum is not African. It is never formed in Africa. It could not have formed in Africa. It was formed here. How, therefore, could it come out of America and get into Africa unless somebody brought it over before Columbus? Because it was growing in Africa. It was taken out of Africa, put in the Cape Verde Islands, which belongs to Africa, is just off Africa. And not only that, the Portuguese said to Columbus when he came back on his first voyage that they were aware that Africans were leaving in large boats going far to the west with merchandise. That's across the Atlantic Ocean. Now comes the other question. How could the Africans cross? Europe has always assumed that the Africans were a boatless people, and even when they had boats, they had canoes, the little canoes that Tarzan turns over in the movie. Now that was the main problem, you see, because even though they knew that the continents were connected by a waterway, nobody could believe that Africans could cross that waterway. And the reason why we couldn't believe that is because our vision of the African was profoundly affected by anthropologists who loved to study little people. They went in the bush and they studied the little insignificant, irrelevant African. Now I'm not dismissing the African because I come from an insignificant, irrelevant part of British Guiana, what was then British Guiana. No way you could study my little forest village, exotic though it was, and get a sense of what was happening in Guyana proper. No way could you study my village and get a sense of what was happening in South American civilization. Do not for one moment believe that you could go anywhere in the world at any point of a civilization and get a sense of the civilization. If you came from outer space and went down in the Arizona desert and you just knocked around the sand and you saw a few people floating around, you wouldn't know we have atomic bombs and highfalutin computers and all of those things if you just stood in that desert. And I've often pointed to the story where I went to parts of Europe, in some parts which are extremely poor. They're not like the highly industrialized Western Europe, which had fed upon the labor of the world and the wealth of the world. They did not have the same built-up situation, and therefore they lived in a position where you could see they were very peripheral Europeans. Nobody went to study the peripheral European, and whenever you see the European, you see him at his best. You go back in time, you see the great Greeks and the great Romans. You go back to the living present, you go into the living present, you see the great industrialized European. It is only recently some of you have had a chance to see what lies behind the Iron Curtain, and to see the kind of poverty and despair that lies in some of these places. But we judge the African always by his worst possible face. You never see the African on television unless he's starving or he has disease. You never see a parliament. Have you ever seen an African parliament? When I left London University and I went to the Dar es Salaam University, I could not believe my eyes. You see this room? I studied most of my life at London in a room a quarter of this size. That's London. That was a little room in London. You had some marvelous looking lecture halls, yes. But when I went to Tanzania and I saw the African University, London University looked like a joke. Now alright, so it is Ford helped to build it. But it's not his money, he got it from the Africans anyway. And the point I'm trying to make is that I'm not trying to compare modern Africa with modern Europe. That's a joke, because modern Africa is a far cry from what it could be. Okay, let us make no mistake about it. The exploitation of Africa is something extreme. And therefore do not expect to go running around Africa to find the advances and the developments I talk about. We go back into that history because necessary for us to connect to the very best that day in that tradition, because if you want to be fed by a civilization and by its, you feed on its fine points, its 1,000 points of light, to borrow Bush phrase. Okay, you don't feed on its 1,000 points of darkness. This is how we deal with Africa, and when we deal with Europe, we deal with the 1,000 points of light. It is very important, therefore, this is central. That is what makes it so difficult. Who is aware of the fact, for example, that the Chinese report Africans were bringing elephants to them in ships 2 centuries before Columbus? You can't take elephants from East Africa across the Indian Ocean in dugouts. If you had put elephants in the Santa Maria, Columbus would have not gone very far. And the Mughals of India made the cities and African people admirals of the Indian Ocean out of respect for their shipping. The Chinese had such a magical idea about Africans in water that most of the poor fishes in China were Africans. So these are not the people who were new to boats. They had a range of boats both on the Niger and on the Nile. In fact, Africans spent more time trading on water than almost any other people, except those people who were on the edge of great waterways. Their waterways, the Nile and the Niger, there is no longer rivers in the world except the Amazon. So how could these people be ignorant about boats? We have found all sorts of boats on the Niger and the Nile. We found things like the catamaran of the Pacific, though it's sturdier than the catamaran of the Pacific, the jointed dugouts. We have found power canoes in Africa, 48 men on board, 24 rowing, 24 resting, that could go from Puerto Rico to Venezuela in one day. We have found ships that were older than Christ, 1,000 years before Christ, along the Lake Chad, along the Niger as well, the papyrus reed boat, which could cross the Atlantic. When Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, pointed out that the Africans had ships that could cross the ocean thousands of years ago, people mocked. Papyrus reed boat, said the scientists. If you put papyrus reed in the ocean, it would get waterlogged and sink. And they actually proved it to their satisfaction. They took a big piece of papyrus reed and they put it in a lap tank and it sank. And Heyerdahl said, if I were to take a piece of the Queen Mary, which is made of iron, and put it in a lap tank, it would also sink. So flying in the face of these experiments, Heyerdahl actually had Africans, Abdullah de Jibrin and the Buduma people on Lake Chad, build a papyrus reed boat. And in 1969, the Africans, having reconstructed a boat that was used long before Jesus, put it on the Atlantic from Safi in North Africa and brought it all across the Atlantic without steering. The rudders broke on the first day and it came by itself on the currents. Nobody even bothered to enter into that study. That land and water are two totally different things. Land, once you are not hit by great tempests, and once you are not stilled by calms, water is easier to travel on than land. Heyerdahl showed that on the map, when he was coming from one of the Pacific islands, the map said 4,000 miles. When he clocked the time, it was 1,000 miles. Why? Because water is alive. It moves. This is a spinning star. It spins the water with it. The water moved, the ocean moved 3,000 miles in his favor. When he tried to get back, the ocean moved 3,000 miles against him. It took 7,000 miles to get back, 1,000 miles to come forward. You're really dealing with different phenomena. And most of our anthropologists, who know nothing about rivers and oceans, land lovers all, who went into bush land to study little peoples, to study all their variants and vectors, they had no idea what they were dealing with. The capacity to cross oceans existed for thousands of years. And it is far easier easier to cross the Atlantic for Africans than to cross the Sahara. It is 4 times more difficult to cross the Sahara than to cross the Atlantic. They discovered Africans had compasses in their caravans. E.W. Bovill, in his special book, The Caravan Train, he points to the presence of compasses in almost all the major African caravans. The Africans, in 1325, took 60,000 people across the desert to Cairo. Do you know what that means? Do you know the kind of organization and technology it involved? Do you know what it is to feed 60,000 people in a desert? Crossing a desert all the way from West Africa to Egypt? You must have mastered the art of preserving food. You must have mastered the art of finding water, because that desert is not a joke. It's not like the ocean. The ocean is alive. You go on those currents that move from Africa. There are 3 currents off Africa. One of them, the Cape Verde, spins you into the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. The other one, the Senegambico, spins you to South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. The Southern African current does that, the same thing. There are no currents from Europe that spin you towards America. Europe is 3,000 miles away from America. Africa is only 1,500. Europe does not have the advantage of those currents. Thus it is that not only was it possible for Africans to cross, but several times, even by accident. Alain Bombard, who is not as well known as Torhaida, conducted the most extraordinary experiment. He took an African dugout, which no African would be fool enough to use deliberately on the Atlantic, but he took the worst ship. He took the African dugout without a sail, without a crew, without food or water, and crossed from Africa to America in less time than Columbus or Vespucci. He went further. He took an African fishing kit and an instrument to squeeze juice out of fish, which I knew as a boy that if you are lost on the ocean, the last thing you do is drink the water. You wait for the rain to fall, or if you catch the fish, and it's very easy to catch fish. You don't just have to catch fish by putting out your line. On those cards, the fish come in millions. Millions! This is a live world. All the birds are above. All the fish are beneath. All the winds are behind you. Everything is on. Those are living roads. They're moving. It's not like the desert. The land is still. The ocean is not. It is alive. It is moving. It is spinning with the stars. They never even studied those basic things. They never even studied how birds flew. The same thing happens above the clouds or in certain parts of the cloud stream. A bird goes up and falls asleep and flies thousands of miles. He doesn't have to bother. Once he keeps his thing, the wind takes him there. Just like on the ocean, the wind blows the ship till it is caught in the current, and in the wind stream, it goes by itself. Now all of these things have never been looked at, and then again, it was the assumption too about the static African. The African never moved. Like as I pointed out when I was doing the came before Columbus, I kept up correspondence with the South African. I never told him I was black, because it might have interfered with communication. My name is Van Sertima. It sounds Afrikaans. It's a Dutch name. I was, my ancestors were slaves of the Dutch, because the Dutch once owned Guyana, and the first governor of Guyana was Van Sertima. So I'm Van Sertima's slave, but I didn't have to tell him that. So we had a very nice correspondence. And he was a very brilliant South African of Witwatersrand University. He discovered something very unusual. Using linguistics alone, and only a certain amount of archaeological evidence like the discovery at Ile-Ife of American males, he followed the movement of American males across the African continent. That was astonishing, because nobody dreamt that American maize had entered Africa before Columbus, and he knew that was very... If you could prove one major plant that traveled across the ocean, you've got a hell of a thing, because plants don't travel by themselves, especially cultivated plants. And he showed how it was distinct from the sorghum of the Africans, and how it could be related back, because if they got it from X tribe, it carried X tribe's suffix to the name of the maize, or the name of the plant, and so it went right through. And then one day I was startled, because I had assumed that since this man had made this discovery, it had liberalized him, because he was agreeing with me there were Africans in America before Columbus. Then he writes, Van Sertima, if you were to find the yam, the Caucasian, and the Negro, all three of them West African trading items in America before Columbus, then someone must have brought them there. See the implications? The Negro is only an item. He's not a proper human being. So if you find him where he shouldn't be, someone, a proper human being, brought him there, like the yam and the Caucasian. And then I began, that thing shocked me so much that I began to look at Wiener very carefully, again because Wiener was considered to be a liberal. He had actually had big fights with his wife, who was very prejudiced. And then I began to realize that even though he had advanced, Wiener had, and was a liberal in his time, that he was still contained, because what he was trying to prove in his books, African, the Discovery of America, was yes, Africans had come to America before Columbus. He didn't go as far as the South African, that somebody brought them there, but he thought they were bringing Arab cultural electricity to America. They didn't have anything of their own. Even their magic, he tried to track back to the Arabs. So that what you were finding is that even men who had made major advances were imprisoned within the strictures of prejudice. They knew nothing about African science, they knew nothing about what had happened before the slave trade, and they were fed. Poor Weiner, he had no racist intentions, but he couldn't help himself, because man's mind and consciousness is shaped by the world around him. How can our children not think of the African or people of African descent as inferior when all the films show it to be so? I thought so. What did I know about the African? Whenever I saw him, he was with Tarzan. And it didn't strike me as strange that he was in the jungle, and yet this guy came in after him, and he was in charge of all the animals, and he did win the battle. It didn't strike me as strange. It always seemed to make sense, because he wasn't supposed to do anything but to be grateful that the white Tarmangani arrived on the scene. Now, because of these assumptions, we have difficulty. So that even when the discoveries are made, you cannot relate, because you have to shift. Something has to shift inside. That is the reason why when I finished They Came Before Columbus, I realized that there is no way that you could discover something or reconstruct something and make a whole world believe it, because the world would have to reconstruct itself. Therefore, you have to get at something else. That is why I started the journal, because I realized that we have got to reconceive the African ancestor before we can understand. Even when we have new facts, we have to have a different vision to understand how those facts fit in. Because here is the linguistic evidence, here is the metallurgical evidence, here is the oceanographic evidence, here is the navigational evidence, here is the oral tradition, here is the metallurgical and botanical evidence, and yet it doesn't make sense to them. It's always riddles, because you find the metallurgist never heard of the linguist never heard of the botanist never heard of the oceanographer. So it's all a mystery to them. Wherever I tracked it down in whatever discipline, even when they discovered things, they didn't know how to knit it up, because it didn't make sense. It was a riddle. They found, for example, something more astonishing in plants. They found that an American cotton, Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadense, those are the two major strands of cultivated cottons in America. When they put it in the lab, they found of 26 chromosomes, 13 were African. This is American cotton, ancient American cotton. Not all that ancient, going back, say, about 2,000 years before Christ. And they could not understand, how could this happen? How could you have an African, half this thing is African and half is American, which is what was even worse. The African thing was cultivated, the American thing was wild. How could they intermarry and interfuse so many thousands of years ago? So they said perhaps it floated from Africa by itself. Okay, see, ones are just like my good friend Professor Jeffries. He's dead now, so perhaps I could mention his name. Of Witwatersrand University. If you find African hair, somebody floated him over. If you find his cotton hair, it came by itself. So they actually put it in a tank. Professor Stevens put the cotton in a tank to see if it could float from Africa by itself. He actually tried to simulate the temperature and salt water deposit in the Atlantic, the salination of the Atlantic, and then he put the cotton seeds, and after 2 weeks they sank. He was a little depressed, and then a bright idea struck him. Perhaps they may sink, but they may not die. So he tested them, he asked the linted and found in fact they hadn't died, and therefore he pursued it, saying perhaps they may sink, but they would cling to driftwood, submerge, and come to America. And then in the 3rd week the cotton seeds sank, and the experiment had to be abandoned. Then came a bright botanist, Proctor, who suggested birds flew from Africa to America with the cotton. Since blacks can't move, birds can. And then they found birds do not eat cotton balls for lunch. And they actually choked them with the cotton. They said that it may remain in their stomach, they may have accidentally picked up the seeds and it may remain in their digestive tracts over long periods. Then they found that wouldn't work, because when it came out of the digestive tract, it would lose both form and potency. Then they suggested perhaps it came across the Bering Straits. It was absurd, because the only possible cotton that could have come across the Bering Straits was an Asiatic cotton. And the Asiatic cotton, Gossypium arboreum, is a later mutation of the African cotton, Gossypium herbaceum, which is the ancestor of the American cotton, Hirsutum and barbadense. So now they were faced with a real mystery. But they insisted on that until Hutchison showed that the frost would have killed it. Then it was abandoned, it was a riddle, it was a mystery. Because it involved the movement of African types, and since African types were seen in a certain context, you could not proceed any further. So I'm trying to show you that prejudice has made it difficult to build a scientific history. And the assumption too that unless it's written down, that it doesn't exist, and that when it is written down, that's it. When in fact the people who are writing it down have no idea of what they're doing, except they're making it so. You look at the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian now has an exhibit in Washington, D.C., in which they show all the early people to be white. Now all the discoveries show that that's not impossible, that men are not, there are no inferior superior races, but that the black figure born in Africa had to be born black because of the intensity of the sun and the ultraviolet radiation, etc. Yet they present him as pink because they can't jump. Okay, it's impossible to make that jump. Now you see, that imprisoning element in prejudice imprisons the people who are the objects of the prejudice. It also imprisons the people who project the prejudice. So then you find, even when discoveries are made, they become difficult. Now my testimony to Congress brought up many elements, not just the late pre-Columbian journeys, but other things that had happened in America that indicated that you had this movement across the Atlantic. And another thing I pointed out is that Columbus never once put foot on the American continent, north or south. He only wandered on the periphery. It is true that on August the 7th, 1498, 3 of his ships landed in South America near the Gulf of Paria, but he did not come off the ship. He said he had arthritis. Would not come off the ship. He sent the landing party aboard, they made a cursory examination, and they sent back news to Spain that the landmass was an island. Just as they sent back word in Cuba that Cuba was the continent. And Columbus, I believe, was deliberately doing this. But I found a letter he had written to Louis Santander, the Chancellor of Aragon, 6 months before he wrote King Ferdinand, saying that I am certain that Cuba is an island because the people who have lived there for centuries have told me so. So that even though his little ships could not circumnavigate Cuba, which is very large, for little Columbus's Santa Maria, nevertheless he knew that was not the continent. But why was he doing this? Because Columbus was cheating all the way. First of all, he had a bright idea which wasn't his. The Moors knew that, the Egyptians knew that the world was wrong, and Columbus said, why are you wasting all this time going all around Africa in order to get to India, or going to the difficult Mediterranean with all the hostile Muslims, etc., to get to India? Marco Polo had fired the imagination of Europe with all the talk of the spices and treasures of the Indies. So everybody was fighting to get to India. The Portuguese were going all the way around the difficult Cape in order to get up into the Indian Ocean. And then Columbus comes along and says, since the world is wrong, you could go far to the west and end up in the east. Wasn't his idea, but that is correct. What the poor fella didn't know is that you would need an airplane to do it. Because if you move far to the west, you would meet another landmass. So when Columbus eventually convinced after, and this is the one remarkable thing about him, his persistence, his commitment to a certain dream, so that even though he was snubbed in the Portuguese court, he went to the Spanish, and eventually persuaded them to help him, and they financed the fleet, and he came through. And he set out, he struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. And when he came and he found these poor little islands, not the rich lands of Cathay that Marco Polo had spoken of, Columbus couldn't go back home and says, I'm sorry, wasted your money, sorry, didn't find India. No, sir. He then set out on a deliberate scheme of deception. He sent his notary, Fernando Pires de Luna, among the ships and made every man sign a document that they had come to the coast of Asia. They were just off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. If there were officers, they would be fined 500 maravedis. And if there were common sailors, they would be given 100 lashes and have their tongues cut out, if later they were to say they weren't off the coast of Asia. So Columbus knew he couldn't go back home with that. That's why this place was called India. It wasn't called America. That's why we still calling the Americans Indians. That's why we call the Caribbean the West Indies. This was the India he found in the West. Okay. Now, this great dream and this great myth brought people in great numbers coming across the seas. Then is when Europe made advances that put it ahead of the world. Because nobody before, because Europe had to come in great numbers here to dream of gold and new lands, etc. Because Europe was suffering deeply. Europe is not an extremely large body of land. Many of its peasants were in great straits. Europeans suffered deeply. Just like other peoples, they had the tremendous population pressure in small lands. They needed to expand. And here was an opportunity so that even though gold was not found in the quantities in which they thought they would find it, and there were all these myths, it drew people here. And it is when they started to come across the seas in numbers that they started to develop new innovations among ships. And then, of course, the slave trade then halted the burgeoning technologies in Africa. It is very important to note, however, that the Industrial Revolution was not simply made possible by European genius and its expansion. It was made possible partly through the genius of other people. The Industrial Revolution is not simply a result of European genius, because there are so many elements that came into Europe just before the Renaissance. Europe had fallen into a dark age. After the glory of Greece and Rome had faded, Europe was struck by something worse than AIDS, the Black Death. AIDS had not yet reached the proportion which it kills 50% of our population, but it practically did that in certain parts of Europe. Cholera was rife, and there were some parts where just like how you take out garbage, in the morning they were taking out bodies. And then came invasions. Invasions by Arabs and Africans. The Moorish invasions. The Muslims established 4 dynasties in the heart of Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, up into Sicily, into Portugal, into Spain, and a small part of France. And many things were brought into Europe which now just passes as though it was all European. Windmills for the first time, crankshafts, worm and pinion gears operated hydraulically, algebra, that's not European in origin. Everything that could be translated from the ancient and medieval world out of Egypt, out of Persia, out of Timbuktu, out of Sankore, out of the Arab world, out of India, out of China, was brought into the courts of Morocco, in Africa, and in the courts of Spain and Portugal. Everything that could be translated was translated into Arabic, and that became the language of science. They brought strawberries for the first time into Europe. They brought lemon, they brought ginger. They brought new concepts in trigonometry. They brought us optics. The first eyeglasses were cut by the Moors. They brought air conditioning into Europe. Air conditioning with perfume, air conditioning. They ran it over beds of flowers. They took the water from the mountains and ran it down in lead pipes into the private houses. They introduced hot and cold water systems for the first time in Europe. They gave the Europeans ciphers. Europe had number systems, but it did not have ciphers. Today we count with ciphers. We do not have letters for numbers as the Europeans did. We have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The Moors brought it out of India and brought it into Europe. And when they brought it to Europe, the Europeans would have none of it, because the church ruled numbers are works of the devil. It actually became a capital offense in the 17th century to study advanced mathematics and Arabic documents. That was the feeling about that. When Fibonacci in 1202 found the number system, the ciphers in India, and brought it into Europe, they would have none of it. One cannot deny the tremendous achievements of Europe in science. Europe seized the technological initiative 5 centuries ago, and it is ahead of the rest of the world. But let us not forget that these things were not possible because of the genius of one people. Those were special circumstances that made this possible. Europe did not even invent the gun, which was to become so central in the conquest of the world. It was the Moors who took gunpowder technology out of China. They were the first people to use the fire stick. You could see the Moors using the fire stick in their invasion of India. Gunpowder technology brought into China, into Europe. Even the sails on the ships of Columbus when he set out, though he later changed those sails, were Arab, Latin sails which Arabs and Africans were using on the Indian Ocean. Even the compass, the astrolabe, through the Greeks had taken the astrolabe, they'd refined the astrolabe, but the compass came out of China. The Moors had brought it, and it went through all sorts of Arab refinements before it turned up on European ships. So it's a world technology, a world brain, a world genius, the composite of many things that made these jumps possible. And it's only because of 5 centuries of slavery and second-class citizenship that we have come to believe that one people did it all and the other people did nothing. And that is why it becomes difficult now to restructure history. Because when we find new facts, we cannot accept them because they seem to make no sense in terms of the figures we're dealing with in our heads. And many haven't escaped this. It's not just a question of whites, because this is not a question of colors, it's a question of consciousness, of being able to make that leap beyond colors, of being able to become aware of what had happened in the world. That conquest was an extraordinary conquest. You can't talk about, as I said, the Congress, you can't commemorate 1992 as the achievement of one people. If you're going to have a commemoration, it has to recognize and celebrate cross-cultural streams, because that is what made America. America is not America because of Europe. The Native American gave us so many foods. It gave so many foods to Europe, so many foods to Europe that it doubled the food supply in Europe in 30 years. And the Africans didn't just give muscle, just sweat and blood and their freedom. They gave a lot more to enrich America. Therefore, if we're going to have a celebration, let us celebrate cross-cultural development that has made America what it is, rather than consolidate a myth in 1992. Well, after my testimony, the chairman of the Congressional Overseas Committee urged the Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission not to refer in future to this as a discovery, but merely as a contact, as an exploration. And of course, that annoyed them very much. One of the members of the Christopher Columbus Commission rushed out and told the New York Times, even if Columbus was not the first to come to the New World, he was the first to go back and give a press conference. And at least that's some kind of a modification, isn't it? Now, it is not just in the late pre-Columbian period that we have evidence of connections. Most important is the connection that occurred long, long before Columbus was a twinkle. And that connection occurred even before Christ, not just before Columbus, and it occurred in the most critical period of American history. Let us deal with that. What evidence do we have for this? Now, in 1858, some Mexican peasants in a village called Tres Zapotes discovered a large stone head. I wonder if you could throw the lights now, because you need to see some of these things. If someone could turn on the okay, sorry. Not working. I had to turn on the recorder. No, I don't. Okay, okay. In this area, Tres Zapotes is way back here. You see those diamond points. And by the way, wherever you see the diamond points, it's where they found an African presence. At Tres Zapotes, in 1858, Mexican peasants discovered a large stone head. This stone head had Africoid-type features, the jugular jaw, the broad nose, the full lips, etc. Now that can be not entirely dismissed, but it isn't enough, because one could say, well, there are some Asiatic, since Africa peopled the world, there are some Asiatic types who still retain a powerful Negroid or Africoid element. Okay, but now look at this. In 1862 came another discovery. This is the discovery now in 1862, where we not only saw the front of the head. Now this is 10 tons. One head, 10 tons. It's taller than a man. It's a colossal head. This is the side of that head. Now look at this. This is the back of the head. Now this has never been published by the Smithsonian or the National Geographic. It is as if it does not exist. This was found in files of the Smithsonian. The National Geographic loves photographs, but I never saw this one. In fact, this was so well hidden that the two leading proponents of an African presence in America, Ivan van Sertima and Alexander von Moutenot, who spent 45 years in Mexico, we did not know about this. We knew of the head, but we didn't know about the braids. It doesn't even appear in they came before Columbus. You cannot imagine how many things are hidden and put aside because they are embarrassing. Why did Michael Coe, who wrote Ancient Mexico, knows all about these heads, never published this photograph? Why didn't the National Geographic? Because there is no head found in American sculpture that has the 7-braided hairstyle. That is found in Egypt, it is found in Nubia, it is found in parts of Western Africa, it's not found in Mexico. So it's not just a question about the broad nose and the full lips and the jug of the jaw, what they call prognathism, but there's a cultural element that is unusual. It is actually mentioned in the Spanish book by Beatriz de la Fuentes, and I only became aware of it, as I say, about 2 or 3 years ago. Now, we have found, even after they came before Columbus, they have found quite a number of these heads. One of them, in fact, I'm sorry I can't show it tonight because we don't have the slide for it. It's sunken in a pit, and one day it appeared with his face staring upwards. You know they haven't removed it from the pit yet. There's a big argument going on between the area or region in which it is found and the national government as who is responsible for taking it out of the pit. Now these heads, some of them look like Afro-Asiatic, obviously mixtures between an Africoid element and Asiatic element, but some of them are strikingly Africoid. Now people could say, but some Africoid types could have come across the Bering Strait. But the study of these types show that this is not a type that merely came in with the Asiatic and melted and blended into the billion-body gene pool of the Native American. These are new entrants. These are people who migrated at a specific point in time. Because we have studied closely the sculpture of the early American before this head. The American did not learn his art at all from anybody from outside. This has nothing to do with art. Get that very clear. This is not artistic influence. These are potters or sculptors looking at something that is alien to them and noting its features, because this should not have been drawn here. It is deliberately cut out by the native because the helmet should have covered it, as it does in most of the cases. It's only in 2 cases we see hair on the stone heads, but in the terracotta we have dozens of the terracotta in which we can see the hair. Now this shows you the size of these heads. Now in spite of the fact, as I say, that you have thousands of pieces made by the Native American, he does not make a colossal head. The African got very fascinated in Egypt and Nubia and parts of West Africa with making a head alone. The head was the seat of consciousness. Even in their sculptures where they make the whole body, you notice they have a tendency to make the head bigger than it is in proportion to the body. It's not that they don't know about proportion. It's because they consider it the seat of consciousness is more important. And this colossal head, 10 feet high, 6 to 9 feet high, weighing from 10 to 40 tons. This is a 38 ton. 38 ton. And Michael Coe was asked, why do you believe, okay, this is not one from America now, this is a stone head from Africa showing you the involvement with the kind of head. That's in Africa? That's in Africa. These are a series of the various parts of America. That is Ladakh, that is not, that is the rain god. Now look at it closely. This one has recently been removed, although it has remained quite solid for 3,000 years in the sun and rain. It's recently been removed because acid rain is beginning to destroy some of these things. That is Tressopotes. Okay, this is a Nubian sheep, so we can make a comparison. Here it is again. Now that doesn't appear in Michael Coo though these heads are avoided. Now here you can see the hair style. This is supposed to be a Native American Indian. Okay. Now this puzzles people because this is before Christ. We have found the first sequence of these heads, even though they're found in 1938, 1939, the first sequence appears at a place called La Venta. They found rooted on a wooden platform. The wood has been carbon dated because you can't carbon date this stone. So if it is found standing by itself, you can know it's very old, but you can't be sure of its age. But in the case, we were extremely lucky that in 1938, they found 4 of these stone heads rooted in the wood. 1939, rather, the expedition set out in 38. In 1939, they found 4 of these stone heads rooted in the wood in a ceremonial platform. And they were able to carbon date the platform at La Venta, which turned out to be the capital of the Olmec world. It gave a reading 948 to 680 BC. It's 814 plus or minus 134 BC. Which is between 948 to 680 years before Christ. It is an Olmec civilization. Now we go back because sculpture in America goes back thousands of years, but none of them weigh 10 to 40 tons and are so colossal they're taller than men. Just the head alone, just a head alone. Now, no people spend so much time on the head, colossal heads, as Africans. You find that with the Sphinx. You find that with heads at Tanis in the Egyptian Delta. You find it in many places where the head is given this incredible significance. You can find thousands of little beautiful pieces made by the Native Americans, but none of them making these colossal heads who suddenly start coming. And then what is very unusual, these heads are found about 60 or 80 miles away from the stone out of which they are made. And it cannot be crossed. They cannot cross the land to bring it there because there's a vast gorge. So unless they levitate, they can't take it across the gorge, which means they have to bring it down the river. Now that is not a joke, because if you're using little rafts or dugouts, you can't bring that down the river. In fact, the Japanese attempted to do just that in Egypt in 1978. They were humbled because they'd seen all these barges, bringing the Egyptians bringing these incredible things down in the barges. When the Japanese tried to put it on the barges capsized. We now know that those are no little barges, that the barge of Hatshepsut is 500 tons heavier than the ship built by Lord Nelson in the Battle of Trafalgar. The Japanese had to use steamboats in order to bring those things down. And in some cases, some of these heads, like Lalok, moved by the Americans across parts of Mexico, the bridge broke. The cranes broke. We found out when we were trying to move things from Nubia, when the Aswan Dam finished by the Russians with the sweep over parts of Nubia, we rushed down there to move some of those monuments, and the cranes broke. So that it involved a different kind of technology. I'm not saying that that technology was an advance of ours. People concentrate on certain things, and sometimes they make leaps in certain areas that we do not make again for a long time. The movement of these things baffles us. And we have found, according to Heiser, that there were identical methods of heavy transport in America as in Egypt. And that there is no precedence for it. There are no long stages where they're making these colossal heads and moving them. Suddenly in one place they suddenly appear. And then they begin to appear in related areas at La Venta, at San Lorenzo, at Presapotes. This is Fontanus in the Egyptian Delta. This is an enormous head too. This weighs more than 10 tons. And this is a reconstruction, imaginative reconstruction by von Huttenot. This was one of the Sudanese kings, pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, the end of the dating equation, and these are some of the stone heads from America around him. This is claimed to be some kind of ancient African script, but I do not know that for sure, and therefore I will not advance it as such. That is advanced by a colleague of mine, Professor Clyde Winters, but I have some doubts about Winters' decipherment, so until we do further studies of that nature, we shall not accept it. This is very difficult to see this. These are the eyes. That is carved. Now there you have, as I say, not just Africoid type picture. Now you have a cultural element, okay, that is very interesting here. There are the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and there is this peculiar thing. And you can't see it now, but there is a hand standing on the edge here. This is a Chalcatzingo. This is cut deep into the heart of a mountain. Okay? And the hand stands like this with a peculiar ornament on the wrist. And we have found that kind of thing in the Nubian world during the battle with the Syrians. Now here come the terracottas. When the Science Digest did a story of me, which was very sympathetic in 1981, and they asked Michael Coe, who was the author of Ancient Mexico, why do you dispute Van Sertima's claim that some of those stone heads are African, some are Afro-Asiatic as a result of mixing with women in the Olmec world? And he says, no, the reason why those stone heads have broad noses and full lips is because the tools were blunt. Now here come the terracottas. Now here are many, many dozens of this type of head now, where you could see clearly the texture of hair, because sometimes you can't tell from the facial features, because as I say, you can't have that odd Asiatic element occasionally, which has the Africoid prognatism and the broad nose, etc. Here now you find the terracotta, which may not be as photographically realistic, but here the effort to show the texture of hair very different from the straight mongoloid type of hair of the Native American. You can see it there. I held this in my hand. This is thousands of years old. This is before Christ. This is in the Olmec civilization. The Olmec, by the way, are the first major civilization in America, not the first culture. Okay, please make a note. There are cultures going back many, many hundreds of years in America before this. I'm talking about civilization, where you have a complex which stretches over a great number of tribes and places. It occupies and focuses over the great area, and it has certain distinctive elements. This is a woman from Xochipala in the Olmec world. There she is again. Now here is the jaguar, which is Olmec. It is very native. Here is someone with a mixture. See, once again, the hair very closely. The texture of hair, but there's obviously a mixture between the Asiatic and the Africoid type. Now, there are many terracotta. Here is one from, this is the pyramid of Teotihuacan, the greatest pyramid in America. Now, that is no native Indian. Now, that is not in the Olmec period, but the Teotihuacan was influenced by the Olmec. It was through the Mayan. Olmec became the mother culture of America. Now, here is one who just pointed out down to the earrings, the necklace, some of the scarification which you could see on the other side of the face, the handkerchief, etc., and the use of black. Okay, you find that in some of the terracottas that they use different colors, the oxide dyes and the clay are used differently from that of the representation of native time. So you're not only getting physiognomy now, but you're also getting other elements. There you see it again, and Bonbutino shows you the comparison between a Nigerian woman and this woman you find at Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is very unusual. It is the biggest pyramid in America. It has the same base as the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is out by 1 meter, and they're allowing the meter now for forcing the reconstruction. It has movable capstones like the Egyptian pyramid, and they found that it wasn't just a step pyramid as people try to claim here that would merely use this temple. They found skeletons. They found burial urns, funeral urns inside of the pyramid of Teotihuacan, so that both the tomb and temple function is satisfied. We also have that at Palenque. I was with 48 Americans at Palenque some years ago in 1984. I don't make those trips anymore, but I took 100 people to see some of these sites, so they could see it firsthand. We went to the Tomb Temple Pyramid at Palenque, and we had a remarkable guide, a Mayan, who would actually help to dig it out. And he came and he listened to my lecture about the Egyptians and so forth and so on. And he came up to me and says, I knew that for a long time. You haven't seen anything yet. There are 400 temples in this area. We have only dug up 2. And he said, would you come during the night with me? And I said, this is against Mexican law and I'm a foreigner. He said, don't worry, I know everything. I even know the police. Okay, but we didn't have time. But we will go back someday to check that out. But he brought us into the chamber. We went far down underground. We had an unfortunate incident that day because I had told all the people who were coming with me, you have to really exercise before you come on a trip like this, okay? Because you have to climb up pyramids and you have to go far below the ground in tombs. And we went far below the ground, and one of us fainted because the air is stifling. In fact, the first people who entered that tomb died because they have, like the Egyptians, they have traps. So that when you open up the stone, some peculiar thing comes out. It's either you get some snake bite. I don't believe that because the snake couldn't have survived that long. But there are certain things they plant there that kills the archaeologists. And we've had terrifying incidents of that in Egypt and in Mexico. Anyway, we went far down in there, and then we saw this incredible tomb with all these strange markings. You want to know how on earth could they take this thing? This thing is so heavy. I'm sure it's heavier than this room. And it's put right into its niche. And it has all of these incredible inscriptions. And when you come down the steps, you must know how hard it is just to take a camcorder down the steps, much less to take something like that and put it into its perfect niche. Now, that is just one of the tomb temple things, because people have argued that there is no connection between the two. They've argued, for example, when I was attacked by the New York Times, my attacker said that in Egypt, the pyramids are tombs, here they're temples. That is a lie. They have found very few bodies in pyramids. They find the bodies buried elsewhere. They find great sarcophagi, but when they open it, they rarely find the mummies. But even when they do, in the few cases that they do, you can show that there's a temple adjoining the pyramid, so that the tomb-temple function is not separated. And then the business about how in America it's all steps, whereas in Egypt it's all conical, that is not true. They began by building step pyramids, and we've x-rayed the pyramids and found steps inside. So even when they built the conical, many of them retained the steps in order to get the ratio of run to rise more easily. So those distinctions are invalid. But there's not only the terracotta. This is found in Mexico before Christ. Now that is no Mexican. That is a drama from Colima. Now this is from the Mandingo period. Before we come to that, this is 200 years before Columbus in Mexico. Now you're having scarification, headdresses, as well as a unique type of physiognomy. But before we come to that, it's not just the terracotta, that is the clay sculptures and the stone heads. Professor Wierzyński, and he's borne out by Professor Davalos, as well as the Miguel Covarrubias, they found, let me concentrate on Wierzyński because this is more modern. He found when he went to the dry areas of the Olmec civilization at Tlatilco, at Serra de las Misas and Monte Alban, he found distinctive Africoid types. No mixtures here, except at Monte Alban where they're beginning to mix with the women more clearly and the Africoid element is becoming less. You find at Tlatilco 13.5% of the priest caste, the ruling caste, are African. He tells it from the nasal root, the nasal aperture, the brow ridge, the structure of the jaw, the texture of the bone. He tells it from the length where they found the extended skeletal material, the length of limb different from that of the Native American, about 1.5 feet taller than the regular Native American. All of these things coming together. And at Tlatilco, at Serra de las Misas, and finally at Monte Alban, where you have only about 4%. And you have actual evidence where you have a woman lying beside the man, buried in the same grave. It was a habit. Sometimes with kings they would be buried simultaneously. Later on, the woman, though she may die later, she would be buried beside her husband. And here is the woman, Native American type, and here is the man, African type. So you do have the survival of that type, some with mixtures, some fairly pure type, because they seem to have preserved themselves for a period of time. Now the question arises, now why on earth should they come? But nobody ever came to America, it seems to me, at first deliberately. Columbus certainly never came here deliberately, he was coming to India. This place was only changed, it was called America because of his friend Amerigo Vespucci. That's how it came to be called America. I have found letters showing their great friendship. They knew damn well what they were doing. I found a letter Columbus wrote to his son Diego Columbus. Vespucci is about to appear in court. Have him do this and do that and do this and do that, for the man would do anything for me. He said certain monies are being paid to me, but I cannot detail them in this letter. I'll detail them yonder. What money is he talking about? On one hand, he was getting money from the Portuguese, and on the other hand, from the Spanish. And that is why he was arrested. Columbus, on his fourth voyage, was arrested by Bobadilla and taken back. He and his brother Bartholomew were taken back like blacks in the holds of the ship to be tried in Spain for cheating the Spanish of his so-called discovery. And were it not for his great presence and his marvelous eloquence, and some people say a special relationship with Isabella, which I have not researched, he would not have got off so easily. He never traveled again. And you know, this story is not stopped, you know. Just a few months ago, the last survivor of Columbus was murdered. Because there are some strong feelings about these matters even now. Now the period we have just been dealing with, however, does not touch so much on Columbus. It touches on an earlier thing, and I will come back to it, because it's not just the physical evidences, because people say, okay, fine, fine, fine. So there may have been some African people who got shipwrecked, who reached America. Now, every major figure in the Columbus period reported blacks, not just Columbus talking about what the natives told him in Haiti. Peter Martyr, the first historian of America, said that he saw blacks, that they were shipwrecked pirates. Okay? Lopez de Gomara said they saw blacks. Vasco Nunez de Balboa, who is credited with the discovery of the Sea of the South, the Mar del Sur, said the day after he discovered Caparicua, he found two tall black men of military bearing among the Native Americans, and he asked them, where did these men come from? And they said they did not know. All that they knew is that they were living in a large settlement nearby. That's Isthmus of Darien or Panama. And that they were constantly waging war with them. And Fray Gregorio Garcia found blacks in Cartagena, Colombia. This is not in the slave trade. He said, these are the first blacks we have found in the Indies. So where are they coming from unless they had settled in certain places? Why did Martyr report it, and Columbus report it, and Vasco Nunez de Balboa report it, and Lopez de Gomara report it? It was just a fiction. So in various times, sometimes by accident, sometimes deliberately, we know of one case that was very deliberate. And that was when Abu Bakr II, a king of Mali, actually set out on an expedition. He sent an expedition which got on the edge of the Amazon. One of them came back. He said he found the river in the middle of the sea, which is the great current that takes you into South America and the Caribbean. And then he set out himself, giving up his throne, abdicating. His brother, Mansa Musa, who was to become the greatest African of his time, and who took 60,000 Mandingo to Cairo, reported it in Cairo. It's recorded in documents. He spoke to the governor of Cairo. It's all recorded of the trip made by West Africans in this direction. But in the early trips, perhaps they started as accidents at sea. Many of them are accidents at sea. Alvarez Cabral, even as late as 1500, Alvarez Cabral was leading the Portuguese fleet. 7 ships right along Africa. A storm came up and blew them from Africa to America. Said he discovered Brazil. Brazil discovered him. He didn't know where he was going. In a few days, the storm and current had taken him to the edge of South America. Now, these are some of the types that we find in America. This is not easy to come on, and I can understand why these are not in books. This, strangely enough, however, should be in books, because this is actually in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico. This is another type showing scarification. Now this is Mandingo period, 200 years before Columbus, among the Mixtecs in Mexico. This is not the native Indian. These are from monks, early monks in Mexico. This is another one. Look how beautifully this is done. You don't need the camera. These are the descendants of 17 shipwrecked Africans in the early 16th century. This is post-Columbian. But note what happened here. It's very significant in South American history. 17 shipwrecked Africans were shipwrecked off Ecuador. And every one of them became a governor of a province in Ecuador. These are their sons, wearing Spanish ornaments, wearing Indian ornaments and Spanish garments. There's a whole story about them. Now this is very unusual because one of the things that they left are scripts. They left markings Now we have a great problem in that matter, and that is why I cannot speak of it in great detail. I can speak of this in great detail because I investigated this one. Barry Fell brought out a book the same time as I did called America BC. He was very viciously attacked, and his book came out the same time as mine, so I got the blasting too from the critic Lynn Daniel. Lynn Daniel, by the way, he's dead now. So, I mean, if he were alive, it would have been nice to have a debate with him. But he was a very dishonest person because he never came to any of the archaeological sites in America. He never studied African archaeology. He knew nothing about the two places. He, 12 years before he wrote his attack on my book and that of Barry Fell, he was writing detective novels in the manner of Ellery Queen. Because of his big name and his impeccable qualifications, he was given the task of writing the attack on me, and as my informant at the New York Times told me, when they first received the critique, they had to send it back and said, point to something specific, don't just slander them. Point to something specific. That is when he brought up this nonsense about the pyramids, and he's never went inside the pyramids. He's never studied the structure of pyramids and the engineering involved, the mathematics involved, the construction techniques. Now Barry Fell, most of his book was built on epigraphy. Now it's a whole new movement in that I today received a very significant document because there are many scientists who have come together in America to find out whether what Barry Fell has done is right or wrong, to dismiss those mistakes he has done and pursue very carefully and seriously what inscriptions lie in America that are not native to the Americans. So it has now fallen in more responsible hands. I don't want to attack my good friend Barry Fell because I followed him on this. I found this at the bottom of the Reef Bay Valley in St. John. Now how did I get into that? Because when I wrote my book, I never considered epigraphy at all, the study of ancient scripts. However, I brought out an essay in the New York Times on their op-ed page, Archaeology Discovery of an African Presence in America, which they subtitled Bad News for Columbus. And I mentioned about the discovery by the Smithsonian at the Hull Bay in the United States Virgin Islands of two African skeletons who were found in a grave at least 200 years before Columbus, a grave dated 1250 AD. And they found, in addition to the strata being pre-Columbian, that there was a pre-Columbian ornament around the forearm of one of the skeletons. They said that these were two Africans in their 30s, males. So typologically as well as stratigraphically it was pre-Columbian, but when they took them into the labs to study the African skeletons, they were startled. Because when you die, your carbon, one of the nuclei of carbon is supposed to go down and one is supposed to remain stable, and they can tell by examining these two roughly within which time you die. When they tried to do that with the Africans, they could not. There was a disturbance. We were later to find that the disturbance was something to do with American military activities. I am not allowed to speak about that, so I was not allowed to even see the skeletons. By the time they discovered in the lab something was wrong, absolute silence, everybody was moved away from that. But I went to the Virgin Islands and discovered these markings along here. This has been deciphered. It's the Tifinagh branch of a Libyan script which was used by southern Libyans, by a cliff-dwelling people in medieval Mali, by the Tamahak Berbers, and by other blacks living in the Sahara. This was carved in this stone at the bottom of the Reef Bay Valley. They plunge in to cleanse yourself. This is water for ablution before prayers. And we have found this dot and crescent script, 7 instances of it across the United States and Mexico. This is the longest one found. This has been checked out not just by Barry Fell, whom I could not totally trust in this matter because of the problems that have arisen in epigraphy. This has been identified by the Libyan Department of Antiquities. Now I must close very quickly because we're running out of time. This is from Peru during the Moorish period. This is just showing you something about the so-called dugout. This is, however, a ship found in the Indian Ocean by the Swahili, used by the Swahili. This is the Ra one, used by rebuilt, it's the finance of Thor Haidal, but actually rebuilt by Abdullah Jibrin and the Baduma people on the Chad, which crossed from Safi, North Africa, into Barbados. These are the currents that took them there. These are the latitudes at which those currents appear. This is how Africa was connected up by caravan routes and rivers in early period before the slave trade. This is the most unusual map found establishing a connection between Africa and America. This map shows, here it is again, this map shows the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and the South American Atlantic coast, some islands in the Caribbean, even a little part of the coastline of North America. This map was found in Africa, in Cairo, in the Sack Library of Alexandria by Piri Reis. It has been established now from outer space as the most accurate map until the 20th century. Nobody in Europe could have drawn this map when it was found in 1513 by Piri Reis. 150 years after the death of Columbus, European encyclopedias reported that longitude had not been discovered and was undiscoverable. They showed the correct latitude and longitudinal coordinates. Only two people had mastered it, the Chinese and the Egyptians. The Chinese were not in the Atlantic. This map shows the Amazon River for hundreds of miles accurately. This map shows the Trata River in Colombia mapped for 300 miles accurately. Nobody mapped it like that until hundreds of years later in Europe, because longitude and latitude was only discovered in Europe in the 18th century. Let me quote Columbus. Columbus was despaired of his pilots. I have 8 or 9 pilots aboard my ships and they are like blind men. My pilots are so ignorant, I am not sure they can find again the lands I have discovered, unquote. This is in about the Olmec War now. These are now, look closely at the face. This is obviously a Native American face, it's not African. But look at the oddities that occur here where you have the double crown, which is only found among the Egypto-Nubians because of special things. Now, standing by itself, it's meaningless because you can always find parallels, odd parallels here and there between two peoples. But when you find a range of those parallels, arbitrary things, the double crown which appears nowhere else except among these two people, then you find things like this. Look at the bird and the serpent. Sorry you can't see this very clearly, but there is a bird above, there is a bird there, there's a serpent above there. Now the plume serpent does not appear in America at first, just the jaguar, which is native to them. Then comes the plume serpent. Here it is again among the Olmec. This has been worn, but you can still see the serpent and the bird. Very unique in the world. There is it among the Mayans, who are affected by Olmec. There's the serpent and the bird. There it is in Egypt. There it is in Olmec world. There it is among the Mayans, the bird serpent. The plume serpent was central motif among the Egyptians, and it became central motif among the Mexicans later. Here in Egypt, this is a special figure, Ptah, which is crook. Here is Ptah among the Mexicans. Here is Thoth, a little monkey with the moon above his head. Here he is among the Mexicans. Here is human-headed coffin found in Mexico. And again, in art, it's found in art in Nubia, it's found in Mexico. Nobody made the human head on coffins. It's very odd. Here you found ritual opening the mouth ceremony. Here in Egypt, the snake-headed stick, the peculiar figure kneeling or sitting, something like an ant. Here it is again, the snake-headed stick. And then you see the priest. There he has this peculiar thing, the head above his head and the tail between his legs. Here you see it again. And both performing the same function. Here you find, forgive me, this is bad photography, my fault, okay? I took these pictures, okay? Please understand, I'm doing this very hurriedly, so you still see my paper clips. But the point I'm trying to prove here is a God, and these two gods are pouring cross streams or libations of him, just like you see in that picture with the cross streams, and they're performing the same function. There are lots of rituals like that found in both places. Here at Atlantis, holding up the world, this is at Potrero Nuevo. Here you see the four signs, that the four hieroglyphs of the sky that you find in Egypt. Here you find it too, showing that there were four, and that there are two here, but they represent the four. Here is a peculiar thing. Now note this. Nobody has these hand-shaped spoons and this peculiar thing that is used here. Now, the name is the same. Copal in Mexico, Kupi in the Egyptian world, and they having the same function, the hand-shaped bowl. And here is the very first pyramid to appear in America. At La Venta, on those slabs you see there is where the first stone heads appear. Right on these slabs. Here is the first step pyramid in America. Here's the first two pyramids, all appearing in the first place for the first time. Here are the first stone heads. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here is the first step pyramid. Here is the first true pyramid, all appearing in the same place, and all appearing on a north-south axis. Nothing else. No ceremonial center was ever built in America on a north-south axis. The north-south axis is only used in Africa for building pyramids. And suddenly it appears full-blown. This is what survives of it, because it was made of clay, 3.5 million cubic feet in volume. It took 18,000 men, 1 million man-hours to construct. And I think we'll close there. These are the books and tapes. Thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I will entertain 3 questions and 3 questions if we can. Yes, go ahead.
There was something on the news this morning about the guinea worm. Have you heard of that? Some kind of a disease or something of a worm that infests your body.
Why does that happen?
Why? I just thought I would ask because it came out this morning.
Can you give a brief discourse on
Go ahead.
Can you give a brief discourse on the habitation of the South Pacific?
What?
Of South Pacific.
Yeah, I have
habitation.
Africans and American people, but on the please, since we have so little time, I would like questions to relate to the next for this. The study of the black in the world can cover millions of hours, okay? It's not as simple as we would like to think. It's very complex. So we let us concentrate on the African presence and American people belonging.
The question of dating, right?
Question of what?
Dating.
Yes.
When you get to the Olmecs, when I was taking a course of anthropology at Rutgers, the professor was saying the body modeling, scarification, and everything was done by extraterrestrials, so forth and so on, completely ignoring the whole fact. The question of dating, I heard that the Queen of Sheba sent an expedition 1000 BC to the Americas, so forth. It's not true.
Okay, you have absolutely no evidence that dating, there are two types of dating that one can vouch for. Carbon dating is off sometimes about 100 years. Okay, but we were able to date, this has been dated twice by teams. They were able to date the platform, the ceremonial platform at Venta, 948-680 BC. The second dating brought it closer to the 948 dating. You cannot date the stone, but the stone was rooted in the wood, so that we know that the platform had actually been reconstructed to accommodate the stone sculpture. That is why we can get the dating. Then there's another dating for terracotta. Von Mutino and I, we each put $1,000 in order to take one disputed piece to be tested by thermoluminescence dating, and it came within the very period we were talking about. A piece that was clearly Africoid terracotta, Africoid features, and people disputed it to say, yes, it was merely found on the site, but it couldn't be of that date. It's not pre-Columbian or pre-Christian. So we went and we paid for it, and it was tested. And it showed that it fell within that dating. Yeah.
With the Hebrew map, when in the book Charles Hepburn says, that certain land masses had formed, so forth anywhere, but specifically the western coast of Beulah, Sedgwick, the mountains that you see above water, certain really tributaries coming out of the ocean had been formed for it. How old is the map? Well, you know,
okay, it's not a map. Okay, the reason why Hapgood had, that's why this problem occurs, is because you have Hapgood put together fragments of map. The Piri Reis map is not, the Piri Reis map has a specific configuration of South American Africa, which is still the same as it is today. Okay, so that it is not before the Ice Age or anything like that. There are survivals of maps that indicate a much earlier period in history. In other words, it is quite possible that there are periods in history that we do not know about. But this is not an alien period. Okay, it falls within the context of the data group. Okay, so the Piri Reis map falls within the context of 1000 BC, etc. It does not have configurations that are alien to that age. Yes.
Do you have any evidence of Africans in Florida and up the East Coast at all?
Yes, that is so. You could find that in Wiener's book. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give Dr.
We have more than 4 women following us. We got a lot of